Hi, and welcome back. In this session, we are dealing with the subject of the waning establishment. And what we're looking at is the period of 1970 and beyond. You may recall that a couple of weeks ago we saw how the United Church in the post World War II period gradually lost its position as the established Protestant church in Canada. Now, I'm using the term established church somewhat tongue in cheek. In law, an established church is the one denomination that is the official church in a country. The established church often has very close ties with the government. Established churches in law exist in several European countries. For example, the Church of England and the Lutheran Church in Germany, and so on. They often receive financial support that is gathered with the other taxes that the nation collects. They have a special place in the rituals and the activities of the nation. Now, in Canada, we have never had an established church, at least in the legal sense. While we were a British colony, the established status of the Church of England had some spillover effects to parts of the colonies in what became Canada. And the same could be said of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec well into the 20th century. However, these were not established churches in the legal sense, but the practical sense. They were the churches that represented the most powerful individuals or families. Their members were often in government, regardless of which party was in power. Being a member often brought connections that could be useful in business or socially. And in some locations, not belonging to that church might create difficulties that were very real, but impossible to prove in a court of law. For instance, two businessmen who were used to seeing one another at church or maybe served on the same church committee might be more inclined to enter into a partnership than one of them with someone from a fringe religious group. Young people could meet future eligible mates through church circles more easily than elsewhere. And so, when the United Church was formed in 1925, and for 50 years afterwards, it could claim, by virtue of sheer membership size and influence, a status as Canada's established Protestant church. With the decline in influence that all religious organizations experienced, that position waned. As we saw, 1965 was the high watermark in terms of United Church membership. Now, I don't know whether anyone has published any in-depth study of this, but we do know that 1965 was also the high watermark in membership for several organizations and service clubs as well. Something was happening in Canadian society, but I'm not sure that the exact nature of the shift is really known. And the shift itself was hidden from most of the population by the continued vitality of traditional groups and institutions. In Canada, since 1970, life has been characterized by an almost continual series of changes. Some were initiated within the church, some were in response to changes that we see in local and global contexts. For instance, in that same broad time frame, we see a rapid growth in nationalist independence movements in former colonies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Canada was not a colonizing nation in the traditional sense of the word. However, the United Church and its predecessor denominations had lengthy history of mission work in some of those locations. And as we have seen, particularly in times of conflict, those missions played a crucial humanitarian role. That long and rich missionary work had a deep resonance with people in the pews. Both the Women's Missionary Society and the relevant General Council divisions had worked hard at telling those stories and making the connections. In this period, the period after 1970, we see the growing unease with the traditional view of the missionary role coming into full flower. The concept that we in the global North and West were bringing something that they needed, namely a knowledge of Christ and the gospel that they lacked, felt increasingly outmoded and smacked of an ongoing spiritual colonialism. Indeed, by the 1970s, the United Church had largely ceased to send missionaries in the stereotypical sense. Thus, we can say that the new language of partnership was merely catching up to reality. To some folk in the pews, however, the shift from missionary to partner was heard as yet one more way in which the United Church was surrendering to modern notions and betraying a gospel command with incredibly deep roots. The United Church's involvement in ecumenical and global institutions was also something that prompted suspicion from time to time. The United Church had been a strong supporter of the World Council of Churches from the very beginning. And given the social and political contexts of many other member churches, we began to hear much more of the language of seeking and promoting justice. And although you and I might hear faint echoes of the social gospel in such language, when it was connected to politically suspect groups, it raised real concerns. One such group was the African National Congress in South Africa. You may recall the times. We can see how easy it was for the media to portray the South African regime as a bulwark against the global spread of communism, which seemed to be on the advance everywhere in the world. And so it was that any group that opposed the regime was automatically suspect and automatically labeled as an enemy of us. And so when the World Council of Churches launched its program to combat racism, which the United Church as a member supported, it was easy for publications such as Reader's Digest to pillory the church for supporting terrorists. And it was difficult for the church to respond because, as often happens, our response was much more nuanced, recognizing that there were, in fact, good and bad issues on both sides. And while we were not necessarily supporting communism per se, we were supporting the liberation of an oppressed people. And we ought to recognize that pattern. The pattern whereby church members take their information and influence from other sources as evidence with which to judge the church. This was especially true in the early years of the program to combat racism. This was the time before we were really aware of the full extent and impact of apartheid. When the severity of apartheid became more generally apparent, that provided a counterbalance to the popular image of South Africa as a bastion against communism. And as communism seemed to be gaining in power everywhere, that bastion against communism was very important, particularly to successive Republican presidents in the United States and to the growing moral majority led by Jerry Falwell. As people became more aware of the apartheid situation in South Africa, the degree of opposition to the United Church's involvement with the project to combat racism began to decline. But it also gave ammunition to those who claimed that the church should stick to religion, meaning the salvation of souls and individual morality, and stay out of politics. So what we see in the social and the political context in this period following 1970, we see an increasingly diverging world, diverging from the old fixed patterns in which the church was born. We also see an increasingly mobile society, and it presented people with many more options, and there was a growing social pluralism that paved the way for sports and movies and shopping on Sunday. Sports and social activities outside the church also began to fill needs previously met by church youth groups. There were also growing numbers of more focused and specialized opportunities for volunteering, with the accelerating number of not for profit groups focusing on specific areas of of social and political life. So people had lots of opportunity to use their social passion and compassion in different ways. At the same time, there were growing suspicions about the relevance of many institutions, and that included the church. How relevant was the church in the modern world? And this led many young people who previously might have entered ministry to pursue other careers. That resulted in a drastic slump in seminary enrollments. When we turn to the more specific focus of society, sexuality, and family, we find that during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the church developed positions on many different issues that confronted church members and the wider society. Some of the more controversial of these had to do with the changing understanding of some fundamental human roles and relationships. One well might ask, why would the church involve itself in such issues? And indeed, many did. For the most part, the authors of such reports and the general councils that commissioned them rejected any notion of the division between church and society, the compartmentalizing of lives into personal and family and religious and so on. Phrased another way, the authors of those reports would maintain that the light of the gospel ought to be shone on widely shared social questions and showed no real concern that a Christian response might not be acceptable to all Canadians. And so there was still the hangover, if you like, in the 1960s and 1970s of the sense of being able to speak to the whole of the nation, regardless of spiritual commitments. Now, we've touched on some of those reports already when we looked at the changing roles of men and women in the church. For instance, there were chain commissions on ordination of women and of the gainful employment of women. And as we saw, these reports were often cast against a background of slowly evolving societal roles and expectations. Not surprisingly, the church's positions created a variety of responses, but some would say at least they aren't meddling in politics. If we turn and focus on issues of relationships and sexuality, it was often the social issues of the day that presented the motivating focus for task groups and reports. Thus, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, divorce and remarriage were topics of considerable concern throughout Canadian societies, as the rates of divorce were steadily climbing. In a 1960 statement, the General Council declared that marriage is, quote, an intimate personal union to which a man and woman consent, perfected in a lifelong partnership of mutual love. Marriage is also a social institution, recognized and regulated by the laws and customs that society develops. End of quotation. In 1962, a further statement by the General Council acknowledged that some marriages do fail and that divorced persons should not be excluded from the happiness of new relationships. In practical terms, this meant that it was permissible for United Church clergy to officiate at the weddings of previously divorced persons within a church sanctuary. The authority of the session to rule on such weddings was clearly stated, as was the fact that no United Church minister could be compelled against their conscience to officiate at a second marriage. The General Council also urged the federal government to review the ways in which the divorced were treated in the laws of the nation, and to establish a division of marriage and family welfare within the Department of Health and Welfare. In the 1970s, the General Council felt compelled to make further observations regarding divorce and remarriage, in part as a response to yet further accelerating rates of divorce. The council affirmed the necessity that Christian marriage be lifelong in intention, end of quote, and directed that any service of Christian marriage ought to include a vow, expressing such a lifelong purpose. Later in that decade, the General Council reaffirmed that decisions regarding all matters related to the conduct of weddings rests with the minister and the local church. In the 1980s, there were several studies of human sexuality, and while some people never got over the shock of the idea of the church addressing sexuality in fairly forthright terms, we can see the logical progression from concern about family and relationships generally to expressing concern about issues of sexuality. Several reports argued that there were numerous issues that society and the church needed to address. The first of these, in God's image, male and female, insisted on the need to address education in human sexuality, changes in societal understanding of sexual expression, society and homosexual persons, sexual orientation and civil rights, and the ordination and commissioning of self-declared homosexual persons. The next step came in a document entitled Gift, Dilemma, and Promise, which made starkly clear several points that had been hinted at in previous statements. All people are made in God's image, regardless of sexual orientation. Marriage is referred to as a gift from God in which persons covenant with one another in the promise of lifelong companionship, expression of human affection, sexuality, and the nurture of children. It also affirmed the value of marriage as an institution and pledged the church to work, to redeem, to care for, and strengthen the institution. Further, it acknowledges that marriage, in name only, is not a part of God's plan and that some marriages can be oppressive. In 1985, a General Council approved educational resources for leaders preparing couples for marriage, asserting marriage as one of God's gifts and God's intention for many lives. To set the stage for our next class, we need to observe the further evolution of history just a bit. In 1988, the General Council reaffirmed the previous declarations around human sexuality and made explicit the conviction that all people, regardless of orientation, who profess faith in Jesus Christ are welcome to become members of the United Church of Canada, and that all members of the United Church of Canada are potentially eligible for ordination and commissioning. It declared the conviction that God's intention for all human relationships is that they be faithful, responsible, loving, health-giving, healing, and sustaining of community and self. And so in our next time together, what we're going to do is look at some of the implications of that decision and the response to it and how that shaped the church going into the 1990s and beyond.